I'm Anya Petrova, and at 30, I had quietly built a name for myself in the art world. My sculptures, my films, even international awards. But none of it seemed to matter to the people whose approval I craved most. My own parents. At home, I was still the daughter who did something with books. Then came the dinner that changed everything. My brother brought his fiancée home, and halfway through the roast beef, she Googled my name. What she found? It shattered the illusion my family had clung to for years, and exposed the truth I had buried deep. That I wasn't invisible. They just never bothered to look. Before I share what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and hit like and subscribe if you've ever felt unseen in your own family. You're not alone, and this story might just be the reminder you need. I grew up in Odintsovo, a neat little suburb just outside of Moscow, where appearances weren't just everything, they were the only thing. Social standing was measured not in kindness or character, but by the size of your home and the university your children got into. Our two-story villa, with its perfectly trimmed lawn and seasonal wreaths on the front door, was the perfect stage for the picture-perfect family my mother, Galina, wanted the world to believe we were. But behind those pristine walls, our family dynamic was orchestrated with unnerving precision. My mother, always impeccably coiffed and rarely seen without her exclusive golf club membership card, ran our lives like a tightly choreographed ballet. Everything revolved around image and accomplishment. My father, Ivan, a soft-spoken accountant at a major firm, had a gentleness that, over time, became indistinguishable from passivity. He deferred to my mother in every family matter, choosing peace over principle, even if it meant quietly brushing aside my feelings in the process. Then there was Mikhail, my older brother by 3 years, and the undisputed golden child of our household. From his first Little League goal to his valedictorian speech, Mikhail could seemingly do no wrong. His bedroom looked like a museum of success, trophies gleaming on every shelf, academic medals dangling proudly, and acceptance letters framed like sacred texts. My parents never missed a game, a competition, or an award ceremony. They beamed from the front row, snapping pictures, bragging to anyone who'd listen. "That's our son," my mother would say with a gleam in her eye, her voice heavy on R, as if he were the only child that mattered. My first memory of disappointment came when I was 8. I had drawn a picture of a fantastical world, filled with vibrant colors and whimsical creatures. My third-grade art teacher gave me an A+ and wrote, "Exceptional imagination" across the top. Bursting with pride, I raced home, holding the picture high like a trophy. "Mom, Dad, look what I made," I shouted, waving it in the air. My mother glanced at it briefly. "Very nice, Anya, but we're getting ready for Mikhail's science fair. Just leave it on the table. We'll look at it later." Later never came. Days passed. When I finally found my drawing again, it was stained with coffee, tossed aside and forgotten. Not a single glance, not a word. I remember the chill that ran through me as I touched that stain. It felt like placing my hand on the icy indifference in their hearts. That picture wasn't just paper and crayon. It was a piece of my little soul, and it had been discarded like trash. That quiet ache of being overlooked carved itself into me like a child's first scar. This pattern didn't fade. It deepened with time. By 6th grade, I won first place in the district photography contest for a photo essay, capturing the lives of homeless people in downtown Moscow. But neither of my parents came to the ceremony. Mikhail had a soccer match that day. "You understand, right, Anya?" my father said gently. "It's a big game for your brother." And I did understand, more than he realized. I was learning where I stood in the silent hierarchy of our home. I was the one expected to yield, to step back, to cheer for others while quietly fighting my battles alone. High school brought more of the same. I joined the school's art club and eventually became its president. My sculptures and installations began winning national awards. My name even appeared in teen art magazines and local newspapers. Yet every achievement was met with the same dull indifference from my family. "Art is a nice hobby, Anya," my mother would say, "but it's not a real career. You should focus on something practical, like business or medicine." Even when one of my installations was selected for exhibition at a gallery in Moscow, they refused to attend. "That tiny place? What's there to see?" she scoffed. "Art doesn't pay the bills." Meanwhile, they had Mikhail's college acceptance letters framed and proudly displayed in the living room for all guests to admire. By the time college came around, I had stopped sharing my accomplishments with them. I chose an art university in St. Petersburg, about as far from Ohio as my scholarship could take me. The distance wasn't just geographical, it was emotional. I needed space to become someone, anyone, other than the invisible daughter I'd always been at home. During those 4 years, I blossomed. My professors championed my work, encouraged my voice, and urged me to submit my art to major galleries. Slowly, success began to accumulate. A sculpture here, a painting there. Each exhibit laid another brick in the foundation of a self-worth built quietly, without my family's knowledge or approval. When I came home for holidays, I answered vague questions with even vaguer replies. I had learned that sharing my passion only invited dismissal, so I kept my growing list of successes to myself. I sat through endless dinners, listening to updates on Mikhail's business classes, his latest internship prospects, and his well-bred girlfriend with the perfect family. I became an expert at fading into the background, smiling, nodding, deflecting. After graduation, when I announced my decision to stay in St. Petersburg and pursue art full-time, my mother's reaction was as cold and predictable as a Moscow winter. "St. Petersburg is expensive, Anya. You'll be back home in 6 months when you can't pay rent," she declared with unsettling confidence. "Maybe try for a job at a community college if you insist on staying close to books." My father, ever the peacekeeper, tried to soften the blow. "What your mother means is, we're worried about you. Art is a tough field. We just don't want you to be disappointed." As if disappointment hadn't already defined every part of our relationship. Over time, as my adult life took shape in St. Petersburg, I began living 2 parallel existences. There was Anya, the working artist with a steadily rising reputation, and Anya, the family's forgotten daughter who did something with publishing, as they vaguely described it to others. That disconnection stung, but it also protected me. I simply couldn't bear offering up my joy only to have it diminished again. Calls home became exercises in avoidance. I listened to news of Mikhail's promotions, my mother's community board achievements, neighborhood gossip, never volunteering anything meaningful about my own life. I grew skilled at misdirection, turning questions back around, keeping my answers polite and shallow, polished on the surface, hollow underneath. Some might ask why I maintained any relationship at all. The answer is tangled, rooted in layers of hope, obligation, and a stubborn belief that one day they might see me, really see me. After all, they're still my family. And no matter how old I get, some small part of me still aches for their approval, even when the adult in me knows it may never come. So I kept returning, twice a year, bracing for that familiar ache of invisibility. I became the family's ghost, present but unseen. And in time, I learned to seek recognition elsewhere, building a rich life filled with friendships that mattered and professional respect my family would never know existed. When I moved to St. Petersburg after college, I brought little more than 2 suitcases, a laptop, and a fierce kind of optimism. My mother's prediction that I'd come crawling back in 6 months hung over me like a dare. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but nothing had prepared me for just how steep the climb into the art world of St. Petersburg would be. I found a tiny apartment in the Petrogradsky district, a creaky walk-up I shared with 2 other dreamers chasing art with the same reckless hope I had. My first job was brewing coffee at a cozy cafe near Palace Square, working the early shifts so I could spend my afternoons submitting portfolios to galleries and art institutions. At night, I sketched and painted at a wobbly desk, wedged in the corner of my bedroom, often staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning. Rejection letters piled up like snowdrifts. I taped them to my wall, not as reminders of failure, but as fuel. Every no felt, in some strange way, like a crooked stepping stone toward a someday yes. Or so I told myself during the long, silent stretches of doubt. My first real break came 8 months after I arrived in St. Petersburg. I landed a junior assistant position at a small but well-respected gallery. The pay barely covered rent and instant noodles, but the experience was priceless. I learned everything: how to evaluate artwork, curate an exhibit, hang a show, and promote it from scratch. That's where I met Elena Volkov, a senior curator known for her razor-sharp eye and even sharper tongue. Elena was a legend in the Russian art world, famous for discovering rising stars and for her ruthless, no-nonsense standards. For reasons I never fully understood, she took an interest in me. After glancing at a sculpture I had worked on during my lunch break, she looked me in the eye and said, "You have a voice. It's raw, but distinct. Keep going." From her, that was high praise. Under her mentorship, my work began to evolve. She pushed me to take bigger risks, to find the vulnerable edges in my stories and dig deeper. When I once complained about her brutal feedback, she didn't flinch. "If you want soft encouragement," she said dryly, "join a community watercolor class. If you want to be exhibited, listen to me." And I did. I worked, after shifts, after social events, and often through the early hours when the city finally went quiet. I built a discipline that bordered on obsession. 2 years after arriving in St. Petersburg, my work was published in a respected art magazine for the first time. I remember staring at my name on the page, running my fingers across the ink as if it might disappear. I didn't call anyone in my family. Instead, I celebrated with the friends who understood what that milestone meant. Friends who had stood beside me through all the sleepless nights and silent rejections. From there, the momentum slowly began to build. My name started appearing in more prominent publications. Curators began to recognize it as they flipped through submission stacks. Art agents started emailing, asking if I was working on anything big. I was. My first major collection, an exploration of the invisible threads binding generations of family together, took 3 years to complete. When it was finally acquired by a respected independent gallery, the feeling of validation was overwhelming. No amount of parental approval could have matched it. The collection, titled Quiet Fractures, premiered when I was 27. Its initial release was modest, but the critical response exceeded everyone's expectations, especially mine. The Moscow Times Art Review called it a stunning debut by a singular new voice in visual storytelling. Art and Life magazine named me one of their artists to watch. Awards began to follow, one after another, each one landing with a sense of wonder I never quite got used to. To exhibit the collection, I traveled to 12 cities across Russia, and later to London, Paris, and Berlin. At each stop, strangers came up to share how deeply the work had touched them, how they saw their own family struggles reflected in the art. And there was a certain irony I couldn't ignore. People I had never met were connecting with something my own family never even bothered to see. I chose to exhibit under the name Anya Petrova, rather than my full name. Anya and Dmitry Petrova, which may explain why my family never stumbled across my work online. It wasn't a deliberate act of hiding, more a quiet separation, a way to keep my artist identity distinct from the dutiful daughter who still returned to Odintsovo twice a year. One lived in light and critique and creation. The other lived in silence, at the edge of the family table. My second major work, a short film titled The Weight of the Unspoken, became what the industry fondly calls a sleeper hit. It started modestly with slow sales and quiet screenings, but through whispers and word of mouth, it climbed, until 8 months later it hit the bestseller list. The DVD release bore praise from directors I had once studied in undergrad film courses. Surreal didn't begin to describe how it felt. Seeing their names beside my own, etched in print, it was like a dream bending around itself. By the time I turned 30, I had an art agent, a respected producer, and the kind of career most artists whisper about in hope, not expectation. My apartment in St. Petersburg was no longer shared but mine alone, with a dedicated studio, framed posters on the wall, and awards that quietly shimmered in the morning light. My work was taught in university programs on fine arts and creative filmmaking. I'd lectured as a guest at the Royal Academy of Arts, at St. Petersburg University, and a handful of esteemed institutions. Each time I was introduced at events, the list of accomplishments grew longer than I ever imagined. And yet, when I flew home for Christmas or my mother's birthday, I was still just Anya, the daughter with some vague job involving books. My family still believed I worked in publishing. The disconnect between who I had become and who they saw was sometimes dizzying. "Are you still at that gallery?" my mother would ask at Christmas dinner, her tone light, disinterested. "I'm working on a few new projects," I'd reply, truthful but not transparent. "Did you hear? Mikhail got another promotion, she'd add, seamlessly pivoting the conversation away from me. Again. The most recent turning point in my career came just 3 months before that fateful family dinner. My second short film had been optioned for a full-length adaptation by an Oscar-winning producer. They flew me to Los Angeles, put me up in a hotel that sparkled with marble, and treated every word I said like it carried weight. The contrast between that professional respect and my near invisibility at home had never felt so sharp. It stung in a new way. Sometimes I wonder why I keep my life so compartmentalized, why I don't just stand up at a family dinner and say, "Look at what I've done." But the answer is layered, simple yet tangled. I'm protecting myself. After years of dismissed passions and minimized milestones, I couldn't bear to lay my heart on the table only to watch it be waved away. The idea of my mother saying, "That's nice, dear," about my film contract makes my stomach twist in knots. So I preserve the separation, even though it leaves a hollow space inside me. In the professional world, I am confident, eloquent, seen. At home, I revert to the quiet daughter, carefully concealing the life I've built from the people who raised me. "Why do you still go home at all?" my friend Svetlana once asked me after a particularly bruising Thanksgiving visit. I didn't have a simple answer. There's a complicated love I still hold for my family, despite everything. A flickering hope that maybe one day something might change. And maybe, too, a stubborn belief that walking away completely would mean they'd won. That they'd succeeded in making me believe I never really existed in the first place. So I keep visiting, and I keep succeeding. And with each passing year, the gap between my two lives stretches wider and wider, until the night everything unraveled, when my brother brought home his new fiancée to meet the family. And everything I'd built, everything I had hidden, collided in a single Google search. My parents still lived in the same house I grew up in, a fact that made each return feel like stepping backward in time. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, I noticed fresh flowers planted by the porch and new curtains hanging in the living room window. My mother always spruced things up when Mikhail came to visit, a subtle, stinging reminder of the family hierarchy. I parked behind a sleek BMW I assume belonged to Lena, his fiancée. This would be our first meeting, and I was curious about the woman who had captured my brother's heart. He had dated plenty over the years, but none had ever reached the meet the parents stage. The front door opened before I could even knock. My father stood there, his silver hair neatly combed, wearing the sweater I recognized as his nice one. "Anya, you made it," he said, pulling me into a quick, awkward hug. "Everyone's in the living room." I followed him through the hallway, past the familiar family photo wall. I noticed the latest pictures were all of Mikhail, his master's graduation, beach vacations, none of me. It felt like watching myself be gradually erased from the family story. In the living room, my mother was laughing at something, her social laugh, the polished one she used like perfume in public settings. She looked up when I entered, the smile still intact, but a few degrees colder. "Anya, you finally made it. We were about to start without you," she announced, gesturing toward the attractive couple on the sofa. "Traffic is always impossible this time of year," I replied, leaning in for the obligatory kiss on the cheek. Mikhail stood and greeted me warmly, genuinely pleased. "Anya, come meet Lena." I turned my attention to the woman gracefully rising from the couch. Lena was tall and slender, with intelligent eyes and a warm, easy smile. She wore understated but clearly expensive clothes, stylish in that effortless way that spoke more of self-assurance than show. "I've heard so much about you," she said, offering her hand. "Mikhail told me you live in St. Petersburg. I love visiting that city." "Hopefully all good things," I replied with a smile, ignoring the barely stifled sniff from my mother. "Shall we head into the dining room?" my mother suggested. "The roast has been in the oven for hours." The dining table was set with the good china and crystal, an honor typically reserved for Mikhail's visits or her more distinguished badminton club luncheons. I took in the seating arrangement with a familiar sense of resignation. My father sat at the head of the table, my mother at the opposite end. Mikhail and Lena took one side. I was seated alone across from them, equidistant from both parents, like a satellite in orbit. My mother had outdone herself with dinner: roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, garlic mashed potatoes, honey-glazed carrots, and homemade rolls. It was Mikhail's favorite meal, the kind she only prepared for special occasions. Lena, Why don't you tell us how you two met? My mother prompted after pouring the wine. I want Anya to hear the story. Lena smiled at Mikhail before replying. We met at a charity auction for the children's hospital. I was organizing the event, and Mikhail was there on behalf of his firm. He outbid everyone for a weekend beach package. Even though he'd told me earlier he gets horribly seasick, she laughed. I figured anyone that determined deserved at least one dinner. Best money I ever spent, Mikhail added, squeezing her hand. My mother beamed at them. And Lena's family is from Rublevka, she informed me, referring to one of Moscow's wealthiest suburbs. Her father is a cardiovascular surgeon at Central Hospital. Her tone left no doubt. This was code for comes from money and social standing, the highest praise my mother could offer. And what about you, Anya? Lena asked, turning her attention to me. Mikhail mentioned you work in publishing in St. Petersburg. That sounds fascinating. Before I could respond, my mother interjected. Oh, Anya does something with books. Yes. Some small publisher or maybe a magazine. Isn't that right, sweetheart? I opened my mouth to clarify, but she pressed on. Of course, it's nothing like Mikhail's position. He was just made partner at 35, youngest in the firm's history. It's an art gallery, I said quietly. I work with artists and their projects. Well, that must be interesting, Lena offered politely. What kind of work do you do exactly, Anya? My mother cut in again. She's always been such a bookworm, she told Lena with a laugh. I remember one summer we had to drag her outside to get any sun at all. Always had her nose buried in a book. The conversation shifted smoothly, too smoothly, toward wedding plans. Lena and Mikhail were considering a June ceremony, possibly at her parents' country club. My mother was elated, already deep in discussions about floral arrangements and menu options. I ate quietly, nodding occasionally, or offering a short comment when directly addressed. This was familiar territory, being present but not included. A background figure in the grand production of Mikhail's life. Lena, to her credit, made a sincere effort to draw me into the conversation. We're still looking for people to be in the bridal party, she said, her gaze warm and steady. But I'd really love for you to be one of my bridesmaids, Anya. I don't have any sisters, and it would mean a lot to me. Her offer caught me completely off guard. For a moment, I was speechless. I'd be honored, I said at last, genuinely moved by her desire to include me. It was the first time in years anyone in that room had made me feel like I belonged. If Anya can find the time in her busy schedule, my mother chimed in with a thin smile. St. Petersburg must keep her quite occupied, doesn't it? Mikhail shot her a look. Mom, come on. Sensing the tension, Lena tried to pivot. So what are you working on right now, Anya? Any projects we should be watching for? It was the kind of question I had longed to hear, yet secretly dreaded, for years. Here it was, the moment I could finally share my accomplishments. I could have told them about the film deal, the awards, the reviews. For once, I could have stood firm in this house, not as the invisible daughter, but as someone seen. But old habits die hard. I gave a small shrug. Just the usual projects, nothing too exciting. My mother pounced on that moment like a cat with a limp mouse. She's just a desk worker, really, she said with a dismissive chuckle. Not everyone is meant to be ambitious like you and Mikhail. The table fell into a heavy silence. My father stared at his plate. Mikhail shifted uncomfortably. I felt that old sting rise again, sharper now, because it had been spoken out loud in front of someone new. Lena's brow creased slightly. She looked at me, a curious flicker in her eyes. Then, without a word, she discreetly slipped her phone from under the table. The wedding venue has a 6-month wait list, my mother continued, oblivious to the emotional fallout she had just caused. But Lena's mother knows the events coordinator, so it shouldn't be an issue. As she spoke, I noticed Lena glancing at her phone, her expression shifting, curiosity giving way to surprise, and then to something that looked very much like shock. She glanced up at me, then back down, scrolling faster now, her attention fully captured. I didn't know what she was reading, but something told me the carefully guarded wall between my two worlds was about to collapse. The dinner conversation rolled on without me. My mother dominated the topic of wedding details, my father nodding along dutifully, and Mikhail chiming in with plans for their honeymoon in Italy. I responded when prompted, but my focus stayed on Lena. Her eyes widened every so often, and she scrolled with increasing intensity. We're thinking of a 4 or 5 tier cake, my mother was saying. Elegant but not flashy, something fitting for Mikhail's status at the firm. Suddenly, Lena looked up from her phone. Her gaze locked onto mine with such intensity that I shifted in my chair. "I'm sorry," she interrupted, cutting through my mother's musings about fondant flavors. "I really hope this isn't rude, but I have to ask." She turned to me, phone still in hand. "Anya, are you Anya Petrova? The artist?" The question hung in the air like a dropped glass. 4 pairs of eyes turned to me at once. The silence was deafening. "What are you talking about?" my mother asked, clearly confused. Lena held up her phone, showing the screen, my artist profile on the Tretyakov Gallery's website. "Anya Petrova, creator of Quiet Fractures and director of The Weight of the Unspoken," she read aloud. "Recipient of the National Art Prize and the Penn Misner Award for Independent Film." She looked back at me, her eyes wide with excitement. "That's you, isn't it? The photo even matches." My heart pounded. This was the moment I had feared and secretly yearned for, and I was utterly unprepared. "Let me see," Mikhail said, leaning over to look at Lena's screen. His eyes widened as he scrolled. "Oh my God," he murmured. "Anya, is this really you?" My father had gone completely still, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. My mother reached across the table and nearly snatched the phone out of Lena's hand. "This must be some kind of mistake," she said, her voice shaky and unconvincing as her eyes scanned the screen. "There must be another Anya Petrova." "No mistake," Lena said firmly, retrieving her phone and continuing. "It says here your work has been compared to Frida Kahlo and Marina Abramovich. Your debut sculpture collection was described by the Moscow Times as breathtakingly compelling, and your short film spent 18 weeks on the bestseller list." She looked at me with sincere admiration. "I can't believe this. I actually watched your film last year in my film club. It was stunning." My mother's face had lost all its color. My father leaned in toward Lena, straining to see more of the screen. "And there's more," Lena added, still unaware of the emotional minefield she had just stepped into. "It says your film was optioned by Paramount Pictures, with production planned for next year." She scrolled further. "And you were just featured in the New Yorker's 40 Under 40 list for influential artists." Mikhail looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and something close to hurt. I took a deep breath and looked straight at myself, at who I had become. This was it. The moment when the 2 lives I had kept so carefully apart finally collapsed into one. "I tried," I said softly. "So many times." My mother shook her head, incredulous. "Nonsense. You never once mentioned being some famous artist. We would have remembered something like that." "Actually, I did," I replied, my voice growing steadier. "When my first piece was exhibited at the Tretyakov Gallery, I called to tell you. You said, 'That's nice, dear,' and then immediately changed the subject to Mikhail's new car." My father furrowed his brow, as if rifling through a dusty attic of forgotten memories. My mother pressed her lips together into a tight, familiar line. "And when my short film was released," I continued, "I sent both of you signed DVDs, with a note saying how much it would mean to have your support at the premiere in St. Petersburg. You never replied. I checked flight prices, hoping maybe you'd surprise me, but you never even acknowledged receiving the film." "We were probably busy," my mother offered, defensive now. "You can't expect us to drop everything every time you get a little recognition." "For what, Mom?" I snapped, my voice cracking open with the weight of years. "For the biggest accomplishments of your daughter's life? Because that's exactly what you did for Mikhail. You never missed a single game, a single ceremony, a single milestone. Not once." Mikhail shifted awkwardly in his seat. Lena gently rested a hand on his arm, her expression sympathetic. "When I won my first major award," I said, "I called from the hotel, still in my gown, still glowing from the stage. Dad answered and told me Mom was asleep and he was watching a match. He said to call back tomorrow. When I did, neither of you picked up." My father flushed, a slow blooming red of something like shame. "I didn't realize. I didn't know it was that important." "How could you not?" I asked, the question rising sharper than I intended. How could my own parents not care about the biggest moments in my career? Did you ever Google my name? Did you ever stop and wonder what I was actually doing all these years in St. Petersburg? My mother's lips thinned again. "You've always been dramatic, Anya. If your work was truly such a success, why didn't you make sure we knew?" Because every time I tried, you redirected the conversation back to Mikhail, I said, my voice trembling now. Every single time. Eventually, I just stopped trying. It hurt too much to keep offering up pieces of myself, only to have them ignored. Lena cleared her throat gently. Your film, she said, turning to me. The one about the youngest daughter whose talent is only recognized after she leaves home. Was that autobiographical? Before I could answer, my mother cut in. Are you saying you wrote a story about us, about our family? How could you do something like that? I write fiction, I said firmly. The characters aren't you. But the emotional truth of feeling invisible in your own family? Yes, I drew from that. Mikhail looked troubled, his voice quieter than before. I didn't know you felt this way, he said. You never said anything. Would you have listened if I had, I asked, not unkindly, just honestly. You were busy being the golden child, Mikhail. That's not your fault, but it was our reality. My father, who had been scrolling on Lena's phone, looked up with an unreadable expression. Some of these reviews, he said softly. They talk about themes of parental neglect and conditional love. Is that how you see us, Anya? As unfeeling parents? The question hovered, heavy with years of unspoken wounds. I took another breath. I see you as parents who only made room for one successful child, I said carefully. And I wasn't that child. So I built a life and a career that didn't depend on your approval or even your awareness. And now, here we are. My mother abruptly rose, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood. I need to get dessert, she muttered. Though no one had finished their meal, she began clearing plates with trembling hands. Galina, sit down, my father said, more firmly than I'd heard in years. This matters. What matters, my mother replied tightly, is that Anya's clearly been harboring all this resentment for years, writing books about how terrible we are as parents. Mom, that's not what she said, Mikhail cut in. And you called her a nobody less than an hour ago. My mother froze, plate in hand, as if surprised by her own words. Lena winced visibly. I never said you were bad parents, I clarified. But yes, I was hurt. Over and over again. And instead of confronting you, I poured that pain into my work. That's what artists do. We take our experiences and turn them into stories. Stories that make you famous while making us look awful, my mother said bitterly. No one ever knew those pieces had anything to do with you, I said evenly. I never claimed they were autobiographical. That's your guilt speaking, not my words. The room went still. My mother remained standing, gripping the dinner plates like a shield. My father looked lost in thought. Mikhail and Lena exchanged an uneasy glance, as if unsure whether to speak or stay silent. For a moment, I considered standing up and walking out. It would have been easier to escape this confrontation and preserve what little peace remained. But something kept me in that chair. Maybe it was the same stubbornness that had carried me through years of rejection before my first breakthrough. Maybe it was simply time. I never wanted to have this conversation, I admitted. But now that we're here, maybe it's time we finally tell the truth. I've built a life I'm proud of, a career that fulfills me. I did it without your support or even your recognition. And that shouldn't take away from your pride in Mikhail. There's always been room for both of us to succeed, even if you've never been able to see that. My father took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I don't know what to say, Anya. I'm sorry. I'm sorry we missed so much. It was the first sincere apology I had ever heard in that house. It landed like a stone in still water, sending quiet ripples outward. My mother's defensiveness seemed to falter. She set the plates down and sank into her chair, looking suddenly small. Why didn't you make us understand, she asked. The edge in her voice had softened. That wasn't my job, I said gently. Parents are supposed to see their children, both of them, not just the one who fits the story they wanted to tell. Mikhail reached across the table and touched my hand. I didn't see it either, he said softly. I'm sorry, Anya. His words, unexpected, heartfelt, brought tears to my eyes. I blinked them back quickly. Lena, who had stayed silent through most of the emotional storm, finally spoke. Your work is beautiful, she said, looking at me with quiet admiration. It's touched so many people. That's a rare kind of gift. In the awkward silence that followed, I realized something had shifted. The rigid roles and quiet hierarchies that had defined our family for decades had cracked. What would grow in that space remained to be seen, But there was no going back. For better or worse, I had finally become visible in my parents' home. The rest of dinner played out with a strange blend of tension and quiet revelation. My mother made a half-hearted attempt to serve dessert, a chocolate mousse that barely anyone touched as conversation continued in starts and stops. Lena, perhaps trying to re-anchor the evening, began asking thoughtful questions about my artistic process and upcoming projects. I answered cautiously at first, but as her interest proved genuine, I let myself open up. I'm actually working on a new short film, I shared, for the first time speaking freely about my work in front of my family. It's about two sisters who are separated in childhood and reunite as adults, only to realize they've lived parallel lives all along. That sounds incredible, Lena said. Will it be released next year? If I finish it on time, yes. My producer is hoping for a spring premiere. My mother pushed her dessert around on her plate. I suppose we'll have to wait for the movie version then, she said, in what might have been an attempt at humor, though it landed flat. Actually, I replied, if you'd like to see it sooner, I can send you a rough cut when it's ready. The offer hung in the air, an experimental olive branch. My father cleared his throat. I'd like to see it, he said quietly. I want to see all of your work, Anya. All of it. Mikhail nodded in agreement. Me too. I can't believe my little sister is a well-known artist and I didn't even know. I wouldn't say I'm famous, I said, modestly. Contemporary art isn't exactly celebrity status. Your Wikipedia page would disagree, Lena quipped with a smile. So would the Moscow Times. After dessert, we moved into the living room. My mother excused herself to the kitchen, claiming she needed to start the dishes, though I suspected she needed space to process everything that had just unraveled. Lena turned to Mikhail and gently touched his arm. Why don't you go help your mom, she suggested. I'd love to talk to Anya a bit more about her work. Mikhail, perhaps relieved to have something to do, disappeared into the kitchen. My father mumbled something about checking the game score and slipped into his study, leaving Lena and me alone. As soon as they were out of earshot, Lena turned to me, her face apologetic. I'm sorry if I caused a scene, she said. I honestly didn't realize they didn't know about your career. It's not your fault, I reassured her. This has been building for years. Maybe it was bound to happen. Lena nodded slowly. I recognized your name right away, she admitted. When Mikhail said his sister Anya was an artist in St. Petersburg, I wondered if it could be you. But when I got here and no one mentioned your work, I figured I must have been wrong. So the Google search at dinner was on purpose? She gave me a sheepish nod. When your mom called you a nobody, I couldn't believe it. I knew I'd seen your work. I thought maybe if they saw it too. She trailed off, unsure. You thought it might force them to acknowledge me? I asked gently. She nodded again, a little embarrassed. Was that terrible of me? I paused for a moment, then shook my head. No, I said finally. Maybe it had to come from someone outside the family. They might never have believed it coming from me. We were interrupted by Mikhail returning from the kitchen. He sat beside Lena and looked at me with new eyes. Mom's upset, he said. Dad's talking to her now. I'm sorry, I said sincerely. Despite everything, I didn't want to hurt them. Mikhail shook his head. Don't be. I'm the one who should be sorry. I never realized. He stopped, fumbling for words. I never noticed how differently they treated you. I was too caught up in my own world. You were just a kid too, Mikhail, I reminded him. It wasn't your job to fix our parents. Still, he persisted. I should have noticed. All those awards, all the exhibits you mentioned. I never actually asked what you did in St. Petersburg all those years. Lena squeezed his hand. The thing is, Mikhail continued, I always thought you were the lucky one. Mom and Dad were so focused on me, always pushing, always watching every grade, every achievement. You seemed like you had freedom. You got to live without that pressure. He paused, and then added softly, I never realized the flip side of that freedom was being invisible. His realization stopped me cold. For all those years, I had envied him for the spotlight. He had envied me for the space outside of it. It was a perspective I had never considered. Maybe we could start over, Mikhail offered. As adults, I want to know about your real life, Anya, not the polished version you give us during holidays. His words touched something deep inside me. I'd like that, I said simply. My father appeared in the doorway, looking older than he had just an hour ago. Your mother needs a little time, he said quietly. This was a lot to process. He lowered himself into the old armchair, the one he always used to sit in when I was a kid. I looked at your artist page on my phone, he admitted. The reviews, the awards. I had no idea, Anya, not a clue. I know, Dad, I said softly. No, you don't, he insisted. We failed you. I failed you. All those times you tried to tell us about your work, and we just didn't hear you. He looked up, eyes damp. I'm proud of you, so proud. And I'm ashamed that it took a stranger to make me see it. Lena shifted uncomfortably at the mention of a stranger, but remained quiet. It's not too late, I said, surprised by the conviction in my own voice. To care, to be involved. If you want to be. He nodded with quiet resolve. We do. Your mother does too. Even if she can't say it out loud yet. The evening ended earlier than expected. The emotional weight had left everyone exhausted. As I gathered my things, Lena pulled me into a warm hug. This wasn't the dinner I was expecting, she said with a radiant smile. But I'm really glad I got to meet the real Anya Petrova. I'm a genuine fan of your work. Mikhail hugged me too, longer than usual. This doesn't fix everything, he whispered. But it's a start, right? I nodded, unable to trust my voice. My father walked me to the door. Will you come for Sunday dinner next week, he asked. I'll have finished reading your first film by then. We could talk about it. That simple invitation carried more meaning than I could hold, and tears sprang to my eyes before I could stop them. I'll be there, I promised. My mother didn't come out to say goodbye. I understood. Her worldview had just been shaken to its core. Change would not come overnight. Driving back to my hotel, I felt a strange, unexpected lightness, like a weight I had carried for decades had finally begun to shift. My two lives had collided, and though the impact had been painful, maybe, just maybe, something honest, something whole, could rise from the wreckage. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope that my next visit home might be different, that I might finally be seen, fully seen, by the people who shaped me, for better or worse. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. 3 months after that unforgettable dinner, a package arrived at my apartment in St. Petersburg. The return address read Odinsovo, my parents' house. I opened it with curious fingers to find copies of my books. Not the ones I had mailed years ago and never heard about. These were brand new, freshly purchased. Inside the cover of Quiet Fractures, there was a note, handwritten in my father's careful script. Anya, I read this twice. Once to know the story, the second time to hear your voice in it. I'm sorry it took me so long to listen. Your words are beautiful. They matter. You matter. Love, Dad. I ran my fingers along the grooves of his handwriting, feeling the pressure of the pen as though it had etched into my skin. In the 3 months since Lena had Googled my name at the dinner table, small changes had begun to fall like snowflakes, subtle at first, but slowly reshaping the landscape of my family. My phone buzzed. Mikhail's name lit up on the screen. Hey, he said as I answered. Did Dad's package arrive? Just opened it, I said. It was a surprise. He ordered everything right after that night, Mikhail told me. He's been reading through your work again and again. So has Mom, though she doesn't talk about it much. Our conversations had shifted since that night. We now talked weekly, longer, deeper conversations that had grown beyond polite catch-ups. Mikhail had taken a real interest in my work, asking thoughtful questions about my process and upcoming projects. How's the new film going? He asked. Just finished the second draft, I said. My producer thinks it might be my strongest yet. That's amazing, Anya. Really amazing. He paused, then added, Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. Lena and I were wondering, would you consider screening a short piece or sharing something at our engagement party next month? Something meaningful to you, from your work. The invitation took my breath away. Are you sure? I don't want to take the focus off the two of you. Mikhail laughed. Anya, my sister is a celebrated artist. I'm proud of that. I want our friends and family to know who you really are, not the version we've pretended you were for years. His words hit me straight in the heart. Then yes, I said quietly. I'd be honored. Great. One more thing. Mom's redoing the seating chart for the dinner. She wants you at the head table, with us and Lena's parents. The meaning of that wasn't lost on me. In our family, seating had always been symbolic, reserved for those deemed important, respected. I had always been at the margins, This shift, though seemingly small, signaled something much bigger. "Is Mom really okay with that?" I asked cautiously. Mikhail sighed. "She's trying, Anya. It's not easy for her to admit she was wrong all these years, but Dad's been surprisingly firm about this. I've never seen him stand up to her like that before." The thought of my father, gentle, conflict avoidant, drawing a line for me stirred something in my chest, something I hadn't felt in a very long time, something like belonging. "Lena's pretty amazing too," Mikhail continued. "She invited Mom to join her book club. And guess whose work they're reading next month?" I burst out laughing, picturing it. "Wait, Mom, in a book club discussion about my film? I'd pay money to see that." Mikhail chuckled, but his tone softened. "She's nervous, honestly, afraid she'll misunderstand something or say the wrong thing. I think it's finally hitting her, how much she's missed all these years." After we hung up, I sat quietly with my father's note in one hand and that bit of news in the other, trying to absorb just how much had shifted in such a short span of time. The dynamics of our family, once rigid, calcified, were beginning to rewrite themselves. Clumsily, yes, but sincerely. Last week, my mother called me. The conversation was halting but revealing. She casually mentioned that she had told her bridge club about my work. "Marilyn Ivanov's daughter teaches Russian literature at Moscow State," she said. "Apparently, she's using your film in her contemporary studies course." Marilyn was quite impressed when I told her Anya was my daughter. The quiet pride in her voice, reluctant but real, was new. Maybe for the first time, she was realizing that my achievements could reflect well on her too, just like Mikhail's always had. It wasn't unconditional recognition, the kind I once longed for, but it was movement, and movement, however small, meant hope. The engagement party came faster than expected. I arrived at my parents' house with a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. Somehow the house looked different, not in a physical sense, but in how I saw it, less like a place of judgment, more like a place trying to make room. Lena greeted me with a warm hug. "I'm so glad you came early. Come see the backyard setup." The garden had been transformed. String lights danced above fresh flower arrangements, and a small platform stood near the patio with a microphone. "That's for your screening," Lena explained. "I hope that's okay. Some of my relatives are huge fans of your work. My cousin Abigail teaches art, and she uses your pieces in her classroom." Inside, my mother was directing the caterers with her usual precision. She paused when she saw me, her expression softening just a bit. "Anya, good, you're here," she said, almost briskly. "I've placed you at table 1 with us and Lena's family," she added, glancing toward the seating chart. "And I told the bartender to have champagne ready after your presentation." This level of thoughtfulness from her was nothing short of astonishing. "Thank you, Mom," I replied simply, careful not to make too much of it, for fear she might retreat. "Your hair looks nice," she added awkwardly. "That length really suits you." A small compliment, but coming from my mother, it felt monumental. My father emerged from his study, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Anya," he pulled me into a hug, more animated than I could remember. "I finished your second film last week. That scene where the main character confronts her mentor at the award ceremony. Absolutely brilliant." We spoke about the film for several minutes, a surreal experience in this house, where for so long my work had been a silent presence, if acknowledged at all. My father had always been a devoted reader, but now he was reading my words, engaging with my thoughts, seeing me through my work. As guests began to arrive, I noticed something subtle but significant. When my mother introduced me to her friends, she didn't just say, "This is Anya, our daughter." She said, "This is Anya, our daughter," and then added, "the artist." "She's won quite a few major awards for her work," she continued, with a hesitant but unmistakable pride. She was learning, late perhaps, but learning finally how to see me clearly. Mikhail and Lena mingled through the crowd, often circling back to pull me into conversations, making sure I didn't fade into the background, as had so often been the pattern at family gatherings throughout my life. When it was time to present my piece, Lena's father introduced me with genuine admiration, listing my accomplishments with the kind of reverence usually reserved for scholars or statesmen. I stepped up to the platform feeling a complex flood of emotion, vulnerability at sharing my art in such an intimate setting, pride in what I'd created, and the lingering shadow of that invisible daughter I'd spent so long trying not to be. But this time, they were watching, and I was no longer invisible. I chose a scene from my second film, a moment where a character finally finds her voice after years of silence. As I began the screening, I was keenly aware of my parents sitting nearby, listening intently. Perhaps, in that fictional story, they heard echoes of our own tangled history. When the lights came back on, the applause was warm and genuine. To my surprise, my mother wiped a tear from her cheek. Later, as the party began to wind down, she approached me while I was chatting with Lena's mother. "That was beautiful," she said softly, her voice gentler than I ever remembered. "I had no idea you could create something like that." "You never asked," I replied, not in bitterness, but with simple honesty. She nodded, a flicker of humility in her eyes. "Well, I'm asking now." It wasn't a statement, but a quiet request, uncertain, tentative. The woman who had once seemed so sure of herself, so unwavering in her judgments, was asking for a second chance. "Better late than never," I said, and I meant it. Our relationship would never be perfect. Too much had passed between us, too many missed years, too many things left unsaid. But something had shifted. The current was no longer flowing only one way. Where there had once been silence and dismissal, there was now something new. Recognition, however belated. The next morning, as I drove back to St. Petersburg, I reflected on the long journey that had led me here. The years of invisibility had quietly forged my resolve to succeed, to create art that refused to be ignored. The irony wasn't lost on me. It was my family's refusal to see me that had, in some strange way, made me more visible to the world. I never made art for their approval. I created because I had to, because the stories inside me demanded release. Still, there was something deeply satisfying about finally being seen by the very people who had once looked past me. People who had shaped me, for better or worse. My phone buzzed with a message from Mikhail. "Dad just ordered a full set of your work for his golf club. Mom's panicking over what kind of language they'll be exposed to." I laughed out loud in the quiet of my car. "Progress shows up in the strangest ways," I said to no one. And it was. It truly was. The invisible daughter had at last been seen. The nobody had become someone, not because of a Google search or a sudden shift in reputation, but because I never stopped believing that my voice mattered, even when the ones who should have heard it first never seemed to listen. That belief, more than any award or review, was the truest measure of my success. And now I ask you, have you ever felt overlooked by family or friends? How did it feel when they finally recognized what you've accomplished? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life reflections. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder. Being overlooked does not define your worth. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, sometimes the ones who see you most clearly are the ones you never expected. Your voice matters, always.